Welcome to you all. This is the second of our series of Cycle Law Scotland webinars. I'm delighted tonight to introduce to you Thomas Mitchell, another of our specialist cycling lawyers. And this evening he's going to talk to you about cycling injury compensation claims, insurers, and specifically damaged bike assessments. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Rod. Delighted to be given this opportunity to talk to you all. This talk was originally done a week ago, I think now, and unfortunately we forgot to record it. So this is for the benefit of all of you at home who perhaps missed out on the first time round because you're probably doing something far more interesting. But I believe this is going up on YouTube, so if there are any comments, please put them down below. We won't have a question answer session, but if you would like anything answered that comes out of this talk, then please just pop us a wee comment and we'll get back to you. So as Rod says, I'll be talking about cycling injury claims, compensation, and with a specific focus on damaged bike assessments. Now that all sounds quite exciting, I know, but I'll try and keep it interesting for everybody so that you don't turn me off and go and watch something else. So I suppose I should explain a little bit about our firm. Cycle Law Scotland was created in 2011 now, so we're coming up for 10 years old. And the idea behind Cycle Law was to try and give cyclists unrivaled legal representation specifically tailored for them. We're lawyers first of all, but all of our solicitors are also very keen cyclists, and we take that very seriously. If you want to represent people, you really have to understand who they are. And because we are all cyclists, because we have our own enjoyment of cycling, we can really understand things from the point of view of you, the cyclist. And that's what really differentiates us from perhaps some of the bigger personal injury firms that deal with cycling incidents. So up on the slide there, you can see various members of the firm. That top left was an event we did for in aid of Doddy. And you can see my colleague Zara top right, my colleague Roz bottom right there. We really are all cyclists. It's not just a marketing ploy. It's not just to make you think we're cyclists, we actually are. So I suppose I should maybe tell you a little bit about myself. I started off my career, if you want to call it that, at Cycle Law Scotland in the filing room. I'd spent a few summers learning how the filing system worked and being completely drowned in paperwork back when we used to use paper files a lot more than we do nowadays, which makes me sound quite old. But I always thought I'd like to maybe pursue a career in the law. So I got through all the exams and then went off to Aberdeen University and I did my law degree up there. And for a law degree, you spend 4 years trying to figure out exactly what the law means and how to apply it. So after those 4 years, you then do, if you want to become a solicitor, a course called the Diploma in Professional Legal Practice. Now, you don't have to remain at the university you did your law degree to do this. So I came back to Edinburgh to do my diploma there. And if you decide to do the diploma, you're effectively trying to set yourself up to become a lawyer. So this course kind of bridges the gap between studying law and actually practicing it. So having got through that, I was lucky enough to be given a traineeship, which is 2 years on the job training at Cycle Law Scotland. So not only did I do all the filing initially when I was younger, but then as I progressed through and had my law degree, I then got the opportunity to actually be creating the files, which was, you know, a nice little story in itself. I've been a solicitor here for coming up for 2 years almost now. And I really enjoy the work. It allows me to combine my passion for cycling with trying to help those in need. And personal injury work is very rewarding because you come into people's lives when they're at their lowest and you try and leave them in a better position than when you find them. But that coupled with obviously trying to help cyclists gives me an immense amount of job satisfaction. So I'm very lucky to do what I do. A wee bit about just the differences, I suppose, between civil and criminal law would be good to look at, just to set the boundaries really as to what we're talking about. I'll try not to go too far into it because I know this is only just a little kind of taster, but effectively in the most legal systems you have a distinction between criminal and civil law. In the Scots legal tradition, the main difference is the burden of proof, and that is the burden by which something must be proved. In criminal law, you are looking at assessing something on an innocent until proven guilty burden. So you are always, as the accused, innocent until proven otherwise. That's a very important distinction because in civil law, the burden is lower. It's on a balance of probabilities. Is something more likely than not? And those are the two main differences between the two distinct legal branches, I suppose. There are other differences in relation to how cases are actually carried out, but we won't necessarily need to go into those in too much detail. For our purposes, what we're really looking at is a difference between proving something. And that's why there can be a real difference between whether or not there are actually any proceedings moving forward from a particular incident. So for example, even though the two legal systems are separate, you can have an incident that invokes both those branches. So for example, if you are unfortunate enough to be hit by a driver whilst out on your bicycle, the police might come along and they might charge that driver with careless driving under Section 3 of the Road Traffic Act. Now that is obviously a criminal matter, but separately you might have been injured as a result of that same incident. That is a civil matter. So the criminal law governs the law between the individual, the accused, and the state, whereas the civil law governs the law between private individuals. And when we look at the civil law, we have to try and establish what those relationships are in order to make a claim. So the starting point when you're looking to try and prove fault is the duty of care. Next slide, please, Rod. Thank you very much. So with any civil claim, you don't just go after any old person. You need to establish a few things first. Now, that is commonly known as the duty of care. The duty of care is really, it's a recognition that we all owe each other a duty to not cause harm to the other. And when you're trying to pursue a civil claim, you have to establish three things. And these are three very important things without which you won't be able to progress with a claim. The first of all is, does a duty of care exist between these two people? The second of all is there has to be a breach of that duty. And third, and very importantly, that breach of duty must lead to harm or damage on the part of the injured person. So that's really the starting point for any claim. Those three factors have to be present. In an ordinary claim against, say, a driver, what you'll be having is you're covered by your insurer. So if a driver of a motor vehicle collides with a cyclist, it's 9 times out of 10 the insurer who's picking up the bill if liability is proven. Now, the way in which claims are normally brought is under what's known as the Personal Injury Pre-Action Protocol. Despite what people might think, lawyers don't sue other people very often. We actually are encouraged to do all that we can to try and keep cases out of court. And that's for a number of policy factors, but the long and short of it is cases do not always end up in court. And just because you've been involved in an incident where you're having to raise a claim, it does not mean that you're ever going to have to stand up in a wood-paneled room and try and go through the whole incident again, because that would not be a very good thing to go through. So the pre-action protocol sets a kind of framework as to making a claim in the first instance. If you come to us and you're an injured cyclist, then this is what your claim is going to be progressing under. The first thing to do is the intimation of the claim to the at-fault party. Now, that at-fault party would have to be identified in the first instance. Normally, in road traffic accidents, it is, as I say, the insurer. But you can also have incidences that involve a road defect, for example. The at-fault party might be the council, or it might be another roads authority. Or even you might be cycling as part of a race or something like that. And it is possible that an at-fault party might be the organisation that's in charge of running that race. It does depend on the individual factual circumstances of the particular incident. But as a start point, you always progress a claim initially under the pre-action protocol if it's under a certain value. Now, the way the protocol works is, first of all, when you intimate a claim, you're going to be having a period of 21 days within which the insurer can come back and say, yes, we're the insurer, hello, or yes, we're the at-fault party, we're going to be dealing with this. You then look at dealing with who's at fault, and that's a question of liability. Now, these matters they don't go on forever, really. You have definitive time periods within the pre-action protocol that things have to be done. And it's really 3 months is the time limit for deciding who's at fault. And that is informed by all sorts of different evidence, which might be available in the particular case. But once that's all established, then if there is an admission of liability, you look to move on to the value of the claim, and that's known as quantum. Now, when you're looking at quantum, you are entitled to a number of different heads of damages. Damages is just a fancy word lawyers use for compensation. So you can see up there on the slide, there are a number of different heads which might be available to an injured cyclist. You can see the helmet, your cycling kit, help and assistance provided by family members, expenses, your injury, and loss of income. This is not a definitive list, but it just gives you an idea of some of the heads that may be possible to be claimed. The idea behind compensation is not to try and put you into a position you were to better yourself. Any client I've ever had would always say they'd rather the accident had never occurred. And that is really the long and short of it. There is no such thing as a compensation culture, despite what the Daily Mail might tell you. Ultimately, if a person is unfortunate enough to be involved in an accident, then really you're trying to put their life back together as best you can. And that's what compensation is there to do. It's not to reward. It's a recognition that something has gone seriously wrong. And it's an attempt to try and right that wrong, really. And the only measure by which our society has to do that is monetary compensation. And really, the idea behind it is that restorative justice. It's restitutio in integrum is the Latin maxim which is normally used. It's, as I say, it's not a betterment. It's just to try and put you back into that position you were but for the accident. And really, that's what it's there to try and do. But I often hear cycling clients tell me the first thing they asked after they were knocked off is, how's my bike? And that's very important. Your bike is your faithful friend. It's your steed. You might race it, you might commute it, you might just ride it for leisure. But at the end of the day, it's yours and it's very important to you. And we all have relationships with our bikes. Sometimes we love them, sometimes we hate them, sometimes they hate us and they throw us off. But at the end of the day, your damaged bicycle is something which is quite harrowing, really. It can be a reminder of the incident in itself. And seeing it sitting there in the corner looking sorry for itself is always a reminder of something which has happened to you, which has, been a very negative thing in your life. So when it comes to assessing the damage to your bike, we need to be careful because ultimately your bike's very important to you, as it should be. And when you're assessing a loss, your bike is a very important factor into your claim. You need to be compensated for your loss, but at the same time, you have to find a balance between compensating you and what's known as betterment. Now, the way in which Cycle Law Scotland have been providing evidence in relation to damaged bicycles is through your local bike shop. A lot of the time you will see in cases involving cyclists that large insurers instruct they're normally online bicycle retailers. And all they'll do is they'll look at photographs of your bike and they'll look at a like-for-like bicycle and say, yep, that's the same. So for example, if you've got a road bike, you might have a Pinarello road bike, and they'll look at the way the bike looks. They'll see it has drop bars, and they'll go on to Halfords and they'll pull up the least expensive Boardman, and they'll say, look, that's the same bike. And you're faced with an insurer that doesn't know one end of the derailleur from the other. So the way in which we get across evidence in relation to bicycles is through your local bike shop. We use local bike shops. We're very proud to have a good relationship with them. And the one silver lining, I suppose, from the coronavirus pandemic is that these bike shops were able to keep open, and we were able to still progress clients' claims. The reason why we use local bike shops is because at the end of the day, you have a relationship with that shop, and we don't want to be coming in and taking that relationship away. We need their expertise in order to help us do our job. And here's just a few examples of the kind of things that are commonly seen in relation to cycling incidences. Basically, bikes are not designed to collide with 2 tons of metal. That's the long and short of it. And you can see there on the slide on the top right, you've got a top tube and a down tube that have completely come away. And that's on an aluminium frame because you can see the welds. But equally with carbon, you have to be very careful because carbon is plastic. And as we all know, things can happen to carbon that aren't necessarily obvious to the untrained eye. And even with a trained eye on it, there can be things which have happened internally to the structure of the bike, which might have an effect on how the bike rides or even could lead to failure of the bicycle. So that's why we need to use local bike shops, because these local bike shops are able to give a view as to whether or not these bikes are safe to ride. At the end of the day, lawyers like to think they're experts, but we're not. We really need all the information we can get in order to help us do our job. Our job is just to present the evidence, really. And we need to work with people who know what they're talking about to present that evidence in as best way we can. So this is what your average damaged bicycle assessment looks like. This is something which our firm formulated quite recently, because before we had a lot of bike shops doing it their own way, which was fine, but it led to kind of a bit of a patchwork quilt when you were coming to negotiate settlement with an insurer, because you'd be given all different types of assessments, whether they were sophisticated computer models or whether they were a piece of paper written by the owner of the shop. All were valid in their own way, but at the end of the day, we needed a uniform way to present clients' cases. So we came up with this. It starts really just, you have normal input of data and it moves on to the mechanic details. Now, this is quite important because an insurer needs to know, an at-fault insurer needs to know who it was that actually looked at the bike and were they qualified to look at this bike. So we inputted sections where the mechanic can put in their qualifications. The normal one we normally see is SciTech qualified mechanics looking at bikes. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't an officially recognized qualification for a mechanic. So I believe that experience also counts for an awful lot. I certainly know from my personal experience that if you have a mechanic who's worked in a bike shop for 30 years, even in the absence of a SciTech qualification, you know that this guy or girl knows what they're looking at. So that also factors into the actual damage assessment itself. Moving on, you have the bicycle details. So you have brief bits to input the type of bike it is, the model, the color, and then the type of bike. So lots of people ride bicycles and people ride different types of bicycles. If you're anything like me, you've got more than one bike, and the normal formulation is n+1, n being the current amount of bicycles you have, and 1 being the extra bicycle you're going to have. So when we look at types of bicycles, it's important to understand exactly what the bike is. And by having these data input points, we can get a good idea of that. We then move on to the image where you can see certain types of damage. Ordinarily, you might have A, B, and C. It doesn't really matter. This was just a brief overview to give insurers an idea as to the damage. Most importantly, really, is photographic evidence. If you can have good photos of the bike, it's really helpful. And then it comes to the crux point of, is this bike repairable or does it need to be replaced? Now, that could be quite important in relation to the value of your claim, because if, for example, you have a very expensive road bike that's capable of repair, it's going to be an awful lot cheaper to repair it than replace the whole frame. You might have a custom bicycle that has certain components that have been damaged and certain components which haven't been damaged. It's important to try and identify where the damage has occurred and where it hasn't occurred. At the end of the day, even though these insurers are the at-fault insurer, you can't take advantage of that situation, and it's quite an important legal principle that you're not entitled to betterment. You are not entitled to a new for old bicycle. A lot of people think you are, but you are unfortunately not. We can always make an argument that if you have a carbon bicycle and the mechanic has been unable to assess the damage without an X-ray machine, for example, to see internal cracks which might be present, then you can always make a case for a new replacement bicycle. But it is important to remember that you might not always be successful in that. It does depend on the individual factual circumstances surrounding the claim. And that's why we inserted a declaration at the end. Now, this declaration is quite important because it just gives whomever is looking at this an understanding that the report hasn't been done for the benefit of the injured person or the benefit of the person whose bicycle has been damaged. Primarily, it's been done for the benefit of a court in the first instance, but also any party to that claim. So it's not as though we're going to a bike shop and saying, look, can you tell us that this bike's been written off? Because we'll give you some money for it. That's not how these things work. It is really a relationship whereby we need their expertise and we rely on their expertise and as an independent person to the claim. Aside from your bicycle, you're also entitled to replacement clothing, provided it is damaged. The way in which we ordinarily advance claims for these is through internet vouching. We all have access to the internet nowadays, pretty much. We can look up any type of bicycle equipment that you have, and normally you can put forward a claim for a replacement like for like, or if you have the same item of clothing, you can put forward a replacement on that basis. The key thing that insurers will always ask for, because they know this is a bit of a trick, is they'll ask you for receipts of items you've purchased. Now, if you're still cruising around in your 10-year-old Aldi jacket that you've had for years, and it's your favorite jacket, and you don't remember when you bought it or why, it's going to be very difficult for you to produce a receipt regarding the valuation of that particular item. The thing to remember here, as with the bicycle, is you're not entitled to new for old, unfortunately. You'll often see deductions for ordinary wear and tear. As soon as you buy a new jacket, if you've worn it for a couple of rides, it's going to be subject to wear and tear. That's just the nature of using clothing. So you need to be aware of that. And it doesn't mean that just because your jacket has been damaged or your bibs have been damaged or your shoes have been damaged that you'll be given new bibs, new shoes, new jacket. The important thing as well is any protective clothing is replaced in full. So insurers recognize that helmets, first of all, are a protective item of clothing. So they will always replace those in full because you are entitled to be put back into that position you were but for the accident. And there's no point in giving you 75% of the value of the helmet you were wearing. We have also advanced arguments in the past for carbon soled shoes to be replaced on a new basis, because you will not be able to replace a carbon soled shoe if you're given, say, 50% of the value of that shoe. And if you've been wretched from your cleats, particularly, the carbon in the actual sole of the shoe may be damaged. So we have advanced arguments for those in the past. I've yet to advance an argument in relation to any other protective clothing, because I've yet to have somebody commuting in a pair of knee pads, but you never know. So as I mentioned before, the use of the local bike shop is, an expert for us. But sometimes you need to delve a little bit deeper, particularly when you have cases involving bicycle defects. Bicycle defects are notoriously tricky cases because they are very finely balanced. And I'll not bore you with the actual ins and outs of the law in relation to this. I'm more concerned in the practical concern of how we actually prove these cases. And the way we do that is the use of expert witnesses. So there's a very helpful up on the slide there kind of formulation of what an expert is. So it is anybody with knowledge or experience of a particular field or discipline beyond that of what's expected of a layman. Now, most of us will know how to change a tube on our wheel. Most of us will know how to maintain our bicycles. But these expert witnesses have a level of expertise which goes well beyond that. And the picture there is of a Continental mountain bike tire. And if anybody's ever seen a tire fail, you'll see that that looks a little strange. That is a sidewall blowout, but it looks almost as if it's a tear. Now, this is a case we dealt with fairly recently for a lady who herself was an actual mechanic, a bicycle mechanic. And she was riding along one day, having pumped her tires up to within what was the parameters by which the tire should be inflated. And she was literally riding along a pavement. And the next thing she knew, there was a huge explosion. And unfortunately, the way in which her bicycle reacted after that meant that she was thrown to the ground and she sustained quite serious injuries. Now, we were faced with trying to progress a claim on behalf of this lady against the manufacturer of this particular tire. Now, if someone had brought this into your average high street legal firm, they might say, well, tires blow up all the time. What makes this one different from anyone else? And we were in a similar situation because, as we all know, tires do fail. They blow up, you get thorns in them, all types of things happen. But there was something a little bit off about this particular one in the way it had failed. But we couldn't just say that. We needed to rely on an expert to actually help us say that. We relied on a gentleman by the name of Sandy Gilchrist, who has 40 years experience as a bicycle mechanic, among other things to his glowing CV. And Sandy was able to provide a report for us detailing why the tire had failed, how it had failed, and why it was an unusual failure. Now, we couldn't have done that ourselves because we don't have the requisite experience, but Sandy does. And it's important because without the use of these expert witnesses, we would not be able to prove clients' cases. I'm actually dealing with a case at the moment against a very large German manufacturer of a bicycle where a pivot bolt snapped. Now, pivot bolts snap, I don't want to use the term regularly because they don't really snap regularly, but I've had it happen to me. I have had friends who have had it happen to them. But the particular gentleman whose claim is progressing as a result of his snap pivot bolt was injured as a result of that snapping bolt. Now, we do have Mr. Gilchrist involved helping us in relation to how that bolt snapped, but we also have on board in that particular case a metallurgist, I believe is how you pronounce it. Now, a metallurgist is somebody who looks at the metallic makeup of metals, which I know sounds fascinating. And it is. It's well beyond my scope of knowledge, but I try my best to understand it. This metallurgist is able to provide us with a report detailing exactly how this bolt has failed. And he's able to look at what is left of that snapped pivot bolt and see where the crack started and why it had snapped. So it just outlines the use of experts and really how important they are in progressing claims at times. And Cycle Law Scotland only use the best experts. The important thing to remember as well is that you are an individual. Those are the minions that we all know and love very well. People are individuals, but often cyclists are given a bit of flack because we're all part of a certain demographic. We're all part of the cyclist demographic. But at the same time, cyclists are people just like everybody else. And we recognize that. We treat you as an individual. We don't see you as just a cyclist. We see you for the person you are, and we'll take on your claim on that basis. There's a lot of negative press about cyclists, but also there can be some positive press about cyclists. But at the end of the day, you're a human being. So it's important to always look at your claim in isolation of other factors and always give you advice in relation to the individual factual circumstances that surround your claim. So what if it happens to you? Well, here's a few examples of quite common cycling incidences. These are all from cases we've dealt with. So just have a wee look here. So, I mean, quite dramatic footage, some of those. They're quite common in When you see a lot of cycling incidences, such as me, I deal with a lot of these cases day in, day out. And you do have fairly regular ones. One of the most regular things I see is drivers saying, "I didn't see you." Now, you'll remember in that first clip, the cyclist was wearing a bright yellow jacket and had yellow overshoes. Despite that, the driver still failed to see them. It just, unfortunately, is the nature of when you cycle out on the roads. At one point or another, you will have a driver who does not see you, and that's down to them, not you. And the thing to remember is, if it happens to you, if you can, you need to try and get the registration number of the vehicle. If you did collide with a vehicle, that registration number is the key to any claim you might wish to bring, because that registration number helps identify who the insurer of that vehicle is. If you cannot get that information because, God forbid, you are injured to the extent that that's not the first thing on your mind, then the police have a role to play. When the police rock up at an incident, their first and number one priority is always the preservation of life. So once that is dealt with and you are in a stable condition, their next objective is the ingathering of information. So the police would be able to speak to anybody who witnessed the incident. They'll be speaking to the driver of the other vehicle. They'll note all the details, and that will be available for us at a later date, should you wish to bring a claim. Another important thing is photographs at the incident scene. A picture paints 1,000 words. Photographs are always very good to see if you're able to take them. Sometimes they are vital because you might have a driver just drive off whilst you're trying to exchange details. I've seen it before. So if you can get as many photos of the incident scene as you can, that's always quite important. We produce information cards, these very helpful information cards regarding kind of common cycling incidences, the kind of things you might be entitled to claim for if the worst happens to you. And effectively, what this comprises is free legal advice on the part of Cycle Law Scotland. So we're always here. I know a lot of the time people have this vision that lawyers live in their ivory towers and they don't like to be bothered unless it's for a large fee. That's simply untrue. I'm a cyclist just like you. If you want some advice in relation to any incident or any question you even have, I have no issue taking time out of my day to speak to you. We offer this advice service, but in truth, not enough people get in touch with us on that. So if you do ever have any questions, we are here for you at the end of the day. We serve the cycling community. Do you want to keep going with that alarm? I don't know how bad it is.
What happened there?
There was a power cut here and then they're leaving.
You're back on though, are you?
I am, but that alarm's obviously going.
I can't hear it.
Okay, good. I'll keep going. Would you be able to cut that bit out after for your
Yeah,
advice?
Yeah,
okay,
of course.
cool.
Yeah.
I'll keep on going. Right, perfect. So as well as a free legal advice service, we also have spearheaded this campaign known as Roadshare. Now, this campaign was initially founded by our founding partner, Brenda Mitchell, and it is the campaign for presumed liability. Now, a lot of you may be questioning what the heck is presumed liability. Well, as I explained a little bit earlier in the talk, if you were awake, the burden of proof always rests on the injured party at the moment in our legal system. Now, that is different to the case in a lot of European jurisdictions, because in those jurisdictions, the burden of proof is flipped. They have a recognition that if somebody brings greater harm to a particular incident, then it really should be up to them to prove that they didn't cause, they're not at fault, as opposed to the injured person having to overcome that burden of proving fault, even though they've already suffered as a result of being injured. A lot of our European neighbours adopt this system. It's a recognition that a vehicle is ultimately a dangerous weapon. That was the formulation of words used by a very famous judge in an English. Despite that, we still don't have the similar protections for cyclists in this country, and Roadshare campaign seeks to try and address that. So if you are interested in the campaign at all, please do have a look at the website. It's www.roadshare.co.uk and add your voice to the thousands of people already campaigning for this. Our hope is that it will be heard in Parliament and debated and hopefully passed as legislation. But as you know, whereas you may not know, there is a lot of bureaucracy surrounding that. So it's certainly an uphill battle, but we will keep fighting for cyclists. This is another campaign we run as well, the I Ride 2 campaign. It's just a recognition a bit about what I said earlier, that you are an individual, you might be a cyclist, but at the end of the day, you might be a car driver too, you might be a motorcyclist. It's basically just to show that you're a cyclist, you're a normal person. These stickers are available from Rod if you contact him directly, I believe. So if you do wish to show your support by sticking them in the window of your car, then please feel free to do so. So I think that's all I really had to say. Ordinarily, we'd be doing these calls via a Zoom chat, and I'd be talking to a few of you live, but I'm not now. So instead of a Q&A, you are more than welcome to put a comment below, perhaps like, subscribe, share. That's always very helpful just to get the message out to other people. And we will, of course, get back to you if you have any questions. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope I didn't bore you too much.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. That was really helpful, and thank you. I'm very grateful for you taking time to redo that for those who perhaps weren't able to make the first session.